She was the last sister left at the auction. Then a grieving cowboy spoke just one word. The dust swirled around the makeshift auction block like whispered prayers carried on the wind, each grain a witness to the desperate transactions that had become commonplace in the dying town of Mercy Creek. Sarah Elizabeth McKinnon stood with her chin raised, her calloused hands clasped tightly behind her back, as she watched the last of her sisters disappear into the crowd. Margaret had gone to the banker's wife for $30, her red hair catching the afternoon sun like fire as she was led away. Now only Sarah remained, the eldest at 23, standing alone on the weathered wooden platform that had become their family's salvation and shame. The auctioneer, a thin man named Cornelius Wheaton, whose voice cracked like old leather, called out numbers that seemed to echo in the hollow spaces of Sarah's chest. Below her, the crowd had thinned considerably. Most folks had gotten what they came for: young girls to help with housework, cooking, and the endless tasks that frontier life demanded. But Sarah was different. She was too old for most families to want as a daughter, too proud for most men to want as a wife, and too stubborn for anyone to want as hired help. 3 weeks earlier, consumption had taken both her parents within days of each other, leaving Sarah and her 4 younger sisters with nothing but debts that stretched longer than the horizon. The McKinnon Ranch, once modest but proud, had been mortgaged to pay for medicines that never came, and doctors who couldn't heal what the harsh prairie wind had settled deep in her parents' lungs. When Sheriff Morrison came with the papers, Sarah had made the only choice available to a woman with no husband, no inheritance, and 4 sisters ranging from 14 to 19 years old. She had arranged their auction herself, spending sleepless nights writing advertisements that would attract good families, decent people who might treat her sisters with kindness. She had combed their hair until it shone, mended their best dresses with threads she couldn't afford, and coached them on how to stand straight and smile even when their hearts were breaking. One by one, she had watched them step onto this same platform, had seen the way their eyes found hers in the crowd, seeking strength she wasn't sure she possessed. Now the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Sarah of her mother's favorite quilt. The crowd had dwindled to perhaps a dozen people, most of them already turning away, their business concluded. Wheaton's voice had grown hoarse from calling bids that weren't coming. $20, called out Mrs. Garrett, the widow who ran the boarding house. She can help with the washing and cooking. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Garrett was known for working her help from dawn until well past dark, paying little and demanding much. But $20 would at least cover the remaining debt on her father's burial plot. 25, came another voice, and Sarah's stomach dropped. It was Silas Kowalski, whose first 2 wives had died under circumstances that made the women of Mercy Creek cross themselves when his name was mentioned. His small, dark eyes were fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. 30, Mrs. Garrett countered, but her voice lacked conviction. Everyone knew she couldn't afford to bid much higher. 40, Silas called back, his gap-toothed grin spreading across his weathered face. $40 for the McKinnon girl. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Sarah forced herself to stand straighter, to meet the eyes of the remaining crowd with dignity and tact, even as her future narrowed to a single, terrifying point. She thought of her sisters, scattered now to the 4 winds, and hoped that wherever they were being treated with kindness. She thought of her parents, lying side by side in the cemetery on the hill, and wondered if they would forgive her for what she was about to become. 40 going once, Wheaton called, though his voice had lost its earlier enthusiasm. Even he seemed uncomfortable with where this was heading. That's when the voice cut through the evening air like a blade through silk, clear and strong and unexpected. $100. Every head in the crowd turned toward the sound. At the back of the gathering, a man stepped forward, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She recognized him, of course. Everyone in Mercy Creek knew James Cartwright. He was the rancher who lived 15 miles north of town, a man who had built his spread from nothing through sheer determination and backbreaking work. He was also a man who had buried his wife and infant son 3 years ago, and hadn't been seen in town for anything beyond necessary business since. James Cartwright was tall and lean, with dark hair that showed premature silver at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore his grief like a second skin, visible in the careful way he held himself, in the deliberate space he maintained between himself and the rest of the world. Sarah had seen him perhaps a dozen times over the years, always from a distance, always alone. $100, he repeated, his voice steady as he walked through the parting crowd. He stopped directly in front of the platform and looked up at Sarah, his gray eyes meeting hers with an expression she couldn't quite read. For Miss McKinnon's hand in marriage, if she'll have it. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Mrs. Garrett's mouth fell open. Silas Kowalski's face darkened with anger, but he made no further bid. Who could compete with $100? It was more money than most folks in Mercy Creek saw in a year. Sarah stared down at James Cartwright, her mind reeling. Marriage. Not servitude, not endless labor for someone else's benefit, but marriage to a man she barely knew. A man whose reputation was solid, whose land was prosperous, whose grief ran as deep as winter rivers. She thought of the alternatives, of what her life would become with Silas Kowalski or even with Mrs. Garrett, and knew that whatever unknown lay ahead with James Cartwright couldn't be worse than those certainties. Miss McKinnon, James said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone despite the crowd straining to hear. I offer you my name, my protection, and my promise that you'll be treated with respect and kindness. Nothing more is expected or required of you beyond what you choose to give freely. Something in his tone, in the careful way he phrased his offer, told Sarah that this man understood what it meant to have choices taken away. She saw something in his eyes that recognized the same loss in hers, the same understanding that sometimes survival required accepting help from unexpected sources. I accept, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. Mr. Cartwright, I accept your proposal. Wheaton banged his gavel with obvious relief, declaring the auction concluded. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with speculation and surprise, but Sarah barely noticed. She was looking down at the man who had just changed the entire trajectory of her life, with 6 simple words and a sum of money that represented more generosity than she had ever expected to receive from anyone. James stepped up onto the platform and offered her his hand. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, warm and steady as it closed around her fingers. We should speak privately, he said quietly. There are things that need to be discussed before we proceed. Sarah nodded, allowing him to help her down from the platform that had held her fate such a short time ago. Together they walked through the dispersing crowd, past the curious stares and whispered conversations, toward the small cafe at the end of Main Street. The sun was setting in earnest now, casting long shadows across the dusty road and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Inside the cafe, they took a table in the corner where they could speak without being overheard. James ordered coffee for both of them, his hands steady as he removed his hat and placed it on the table between them. Up close, Sarah could see the fine lines around his eyes, the careful way he composed his expression, as if he had learned to keep his deeper thoughts well hidden. I want you to understand, he began without preamble, that what I offered out there wasn't born from any sudden romantic notion. I've been watching what's been happening to your family, and I know what your choices were. No woman should have to face what you were facing alone. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, grateful for something to anchor her in this surreal moment. Why? She asked simply. You don't know me, Mr. Cartwright. We've barely exchanged a dozen words in all the years we've lived in the same county. James was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might hold answers to questions he wasn't sure how to ask. When he finally looked up, his gray eyes held a sadness so deep it made Sarah's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. 3 years ago, he said quietly, I lost everything that mattered to me. My wife Emma died giving birth to our son, and the boy lived only long enough for me to hold him once. Since then, I've been existing, I suppose, going through the motions of living without any real purpose beyond keeping the ranch running. He paused, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. But watching what happened to your family, seeing you stand up there today, knowing what fate was waiting for you, it reminded me that there are things worse than grief. There's injustice, and there's cruelty, And there's the kind of desperate situation that no one should have to face alone. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, moved by the raw honesty in his voice. I'm grateful, she said softly, more grateful than I can express. But I need you to know that I can't promise to be the wife you lost. I can't replace someone you loved. I'm not asking you to, James replied immediately. Emma was my heart, and when she died, that part of me died with her. I'm not offering you love, Miss McKinnon, because I don't have it to give. But I can offer you partnership, respect, and a home where you'll never have to worry about your safety or your next meal. The honesty of his words, the careful way he laid out the boundaries of what he could and couldn't offer, touched something deep in Sarah's chest. Here was a man who understood loss, who knew what it meant to have life strip away everything you thought was permanent and leave you standing in the wreckage, trying to figure out how to move forward. What would you expect of me? She asked, needing to understand the practical realities of what she was agreeing to. The ranch house is large and it's been too quiet for too long, James said. You'd have your own room, your own space. If you wanted to help with the household management, I'd be grateful. But I have a woman who comes in twice a week for the heavy cleaning. I suppose I'm hoping for companionship more than anything else. Someone to share meals with, someone to talk to in the evenings. The silence has become harder to bear than I care to admit. Sarah nodded slowly, beginning to understand the shape of what he was offering. It wasn't a traditional marriage, but it wasn't servitude either. It was something in between, a partnership born of mutual need and practical considerations rather than passion or romance. There's something else, James continued, his voice growing even quieter. I know you had to watch your sisters being purchased today. If any of them ever find themselves in trouble, if any of them need help or a place to go, my door will always be open to them. Family should stick together when possible. This final offer broke something loose in Sarah's chest, and she felt tears begin to flow freely down her cheeks. For the first time since her parents had died, someone was offering her not just survival, but the possibility of reuniting with the sisters she had been forced to scatter to the wind. Mr. Cartwright, she managed through her tears, James, I think this arrangement will suit both of us very well. They were married 2 days later by Judge Crawford in his office, with Mrs. Crawford and the court clerk serving as witnesses. Sarah wore her mother's blue dress, the one she had saved for special occasions, and had carefully preserved through all the hardships of the past month. James wore a black suit that looked like it had been brought out of storage for the occasion, and he carried himself with a solemnity that seemed appropriate for what felt more like a business transaction than a wedding ceremony. But when Judge Crawford pronounced them husband and wife, when James took her hand in his and slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but something like hope. Something like the possibility that this strange arrangement might grow into something neither of them had expected. The ride to James's ranch took most of the afternoon, the wagon bumping along dirt roads that wound through prairie grass and stands of cottonwood trees. James had loaded her few possessions, a trunk of clothes, her mother's Bible, and the quilts that were all she had left of her family home, into the back with careful reverence, as if he understood that these simple items represented the remnants of an entire life. They talked little during the journey, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Instead, it felt like the quiet that falls between people who are still learning the shape of each other's thoughts, still figuring out the rhythms of conversation that would carry them through the days ahead. The Cartwright Ranch spread across a valley between two low hills, with the main house sitting on a slight rise that gave it a commanding view of the surrounding pastures. It was larger than Sarah had expected, built of solid timber with a wide front porch and windows that would let in the morning sun. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, black dots against the golden grass. It's beautiful, she said as James helped her down from the wagon, and she meant it. There was something about the way the land rolled away in all directions, the way the mountains stood like sentinels on the horizon, that spoke to something deep in her soul. Emma designed the house, James said quietly, his eyes following hers as she took in the view. She said she wanted to be able to see the sunrise from the kitchen window and the sunset from the parlor. Sarah heard the pain in his voice and made a mental note to be careful about how she moved through the spaces that still held his wife's memory. This house was as much a monument to his loss as it was a home, and she would need to find her place within it without disturbing the reverence he clearly still felt for the woman who had planned its rooms and chosen its windows. Inside, the house was clean, but clearly hadn't felt a woman's touch in some time. The furniture was solid and well made, but the rooms felt empty somehow, as if they were waiting for life to return to them. James showed her through the main floor, the kitchen with its large window facing east, the parlor with its view of the western mountains, the dining room with its table that could seat 8 but clearly hadn't been used for anything more than solitary meals in years. Upstairs, he showed her to a room at the end of the hall, spacious and bright with windows facing both south and west. The bed was large and comfortable, covered with a quilt that looked hand-stitched, and there was a writing desk positioned to catch the afternoon light. This was meant to be the guest room, James explained, setting her trunk down at the foot of the bed. But it gets the best light, and I thought you might like it. Sarah walked to the window and looked out over the valley, watching the way the evening light turned the grass to gold and the distant cattle to small dark shapes moving slowly across the landscape. It was the most beautiful view she had ever seen from a bedroom window, and she felt a sudden, unexpected sense of coming home. "It's perfect," she said, turning to find James watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you, James, for all of this." He nodded once, a sharp movement that seemed to contain more emotion than he was comfortable expressing. "Dinner is usually at 6, he said, "but tonight, if you'd prefer to rest, I'd like to cook," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with the words. "If that's all right, I'd like to make dinner for us tonight." Something shifted in James's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look younger somehow. "I'd like that very much," he said quietly. That evening, as Sarah moved around the kitchen that still felt too large and too quiet, she began to understand the enormity of what she had undertaken. This wasn't just about her own survival anymore. It was about learning to live alongside a man whose grief ran so deep it had shaped the very air in his house. It was about finding a way to honor the memory of the woman who had lived here before her, while still carving out space for her own presence. James appeared in the kitchen doorway as she was putting the finishing touches on a pot roast with vegetables, ingredients she had found in his well-stocked pantry. He had changed from his wedding suit into work clothes, and his hair was damp as if he had washed up at the pump outside. "Smells like home," he said softly, and Sarah heard the surprise in his voice, as if he hadn't expected his house to smell like home again. They ate at the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room, the lamplight creating a circle of warmth around them as the darkness gathered outside the windows. The conversation came easier now, perhaps because they were both focused on the simple act of sharing a meal rather than the complex emotions that had brought them together. James told her about the ranch, about the cattle and the horses, about the seasonal rhythms that governed his days. Sarah shared stories about her sisters, about the small ranch where she had grown up, about the skills her mother had taught her, and the dreams she had carried before life had required her to set them aside. As they talked, Sarah began to see glimpses of the man James had been, before grief had carved such deep lines around his eyes. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments, and when he smiled, which happened more often as the evening progressed, his entire face transformed. After dinner, they sat in the parlor with coffee, watching the sunset paint the western mountains in shades of pink and purple. The silence between them had grown comfortable, the kind of quiet that falls between people who are beginning to feel at ease in each other's presence. "Sarah," James said suddenly, his voice careful in the lamplight, "I want you to know that you can change your mind about any of this, about all of this. If you decide that this arrangement isn't what you want, if you find that you can't be happy here, I'll help you establish yourself somewhere else. You're not trapped here." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his gray eyes, the genuine concern for her well-being that had motivated his unusual proposal. "And what about you?" she asked softly. "What if you decide you've made a mistake? What if having someone else in Emma's house becomes too difficult?" James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dying light outside the windows. "I don't think that will happen," he said finally. "For the first time in 3 years, this house doesn't feel like a mausoleum. It feels like a place where people live." The weeks that followed established a routine that surprised both of them with its ease. Sarah rose early to make breakfast and pack James a lunch for his work around the ranch. She spent her mornings tending to the household tasks that had been neglected during his years of solitary living, but in the afternoons, she often walked out to wherever he was working, bringing him fresh water, or simply sitting on a fence rail to watch him repair equipment or move cattle. These afternoon visits became the foundation of their growing friendship. Away from the house that still held Emma's memory so strongly, they found it easier to talk, to share thoughts about everything from the weather to politics to the books they had both read. Sarah discovered that James was far more educated than she had expected, with a collection of books that rivaled anything she had seen outside of the territorial capital. In the evenings, they often read together in the parlor, the comfortable silence broken by occasional comments about their respective books or observations about the day's events. Sometimes James would play the piano that had clearly belonged to Emma, his fingers moving over the keys with a melancholy skill that spoke of years of practice and recent neglect. On Sundays, they drove into Mercy Creek for church, sitting together in the pew that had once held James alone. Sarah could feel the curious glances of the other congregation members, the whispered speculations about their unusual marriage, but she found that she cared less about gossip than she had expected. Let them wonder. She and James were building something that worked for both of them, and that was more than many traditional marriages could claim. 6 weeks after their wedding, Sarah received her first letter from one of her sisters. Margaret wrote from her new home with the banker's family, reporting that she was being treated well and had even been enrolled in the local school to continue her education. The letter was carefully cheerful, but Sarah could read between the lines to see the homesickness and uncertainty that her sister was trying to hide. That evening, she shared the letter with James, who listened with careful attention as she read Margaret's news aloud. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire that had become a nightly comfort as the autumn evenings grew cooler. "You miss them," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. "Every day," Sarah admitted. "I know I did the right thing, the only thing I could do, but that doesn't make it hurt less." James nodded slowly, understanding etched in the lines around his eyes. "Write to her," he said. "Invite her to visit for Christmas. Invite all of them, if their situations allow it. This house has been too quiet for too long, and it's large enough to hold a family reunion." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at his generosity, at the way he seemed to understand exactly what she needed without her having to ask for it. "Are you sure? 5 women in your house for a holiday? That's a considerable disruption to your peace and quiet." James smiled, the expression transforming his face in a way that was becoming familiar and dear to her. "Sarah, before you came, I had peace and quiet in abundance. What I didn't have was joy or laughter or the sound of someone humming while they worked in the kitchen. If your sisters can bring even a fraction of the life to this place that you have, then they're more than welcome." Christmas of 1887 became the gathering that Sarah had feared would never happen again. Margaret arrived first, having convinced the banker's wife that a visit to her married sister would be both respectable and educational. She had grown in the months since the auction, gaining confidence and a slight increase in height that made her look more like a young woman than a girl. Elizabeth came next, brought by the farming family who had taken her in and clearly valued her highly enough to spare her for a holiday visit. She had gained weight and color, and her eyes sparkled with the old mischief that Sarah had feared might be lost forever. Catherine and Mary arrived together on Christmas Eve, having traveled from the neighboring county where they had been placed with different families, but had managed to maintain contact with each other. They were both taller, more mature, but still recognizably the sisters Sarah had been forced to send away. The reunion was everything Sarah had hoped for, and more than she had dared to dream. The house that had been so quiet for so long rang with feminine voices, with laughter and arguments, and the comfortable chaos of sisters who had been separated but not estranged. They cooked together, sharing stories of their new lives while their hands moved through the familiar rhythms of preparing meals for people they loved. James, who Sarah had worried might feel overwhelmed by the sudden invasion of his solitary space, seemed to blossom in the presence of her sisters. He was patient with their questions about ranch life, generous with his time in showing them around the property, and endlessly tolerant of the noise and activity that filled every corner of his house. On Christmas morning, as they gathered around the tree that James had insisted on cutting and decorating, Sarah felt a completeness she hadn't experienced since before her parents' death. Her sisters were safe, healthy, and clearly well cared for by their new families. She had found security in something approaching happiness in her unusual marriage. The future, which had seemed so dark and uncertain just months before, now held possibility and hope. But it was James who surprised her most that morning. As they were preparing to sit down to Christmas dinner, he pulled her aside into the hallway, his expression serious but not unhappy. "I have something for you," he said quietly, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw a small wrapped package. "It's not much, but I wanted you to have something that was yours alone, not something that belonged to Emma or came with the house." Sarah unwrapped the package with careful fingers, revealing a small silver locket on a delicate chain. Inside the locket were tiny photographs of her four sisters, clearly taken recently during their visits to town. "How did you—" she began, but James shook his head. "I asked each of their families to arrange for photographs when they next went to town," he explained. "I thought you might like to carry them with you, to know they're always close to your heart, even when they can't be close in person." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at the tiny faces of her sisters, perfectly captured in the silver frame that would allow her to carry them always. But more than the gift itself, it was the thoughtfulness behind it, the careful attention James had paid to her feelings and needs, that overwhelmed her. "James," she whispered, looking up into his gray eyes, "this is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." He reached up to fasten the chain around her neck, his fingers gentle at her nape. "You've given me my life back, Sarah," he said quietly. "This house, this ranch, none of it meant anything after Emma died, but you've made it feel like home again, made it feel like a place worth caring about." That evening, after her sisters had reluctantly departed to return to their respective families, Sarah and James sat in the parlor, as had become their custom. But something had shifted between them during the holiday, some subtle change in the quality of their companionship that neither of them was quite ready to name. "They'll all be fine," James said softly, correctly interpreting the melancholy that had settled over Sarah as she watched the wagon carrying her sisters disappear down the road. "I know," Sarah replied, "and I'm grateful for that, more grateful than I can express. But it's hard to watch them leave again, even knowing they're going back to good situations." James was quiet for a moment, then rose from his chair and moved to sit beside her on the sofa, closer than he had ever sat before. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say it properly." Sarah turned to face him, seeing something new in his expression, something that made her pulse quicken with anticipation and nervousness. "When I married you," he continued, "I thought I was doing it purely out of practical considerations, out of a desire to help someone who was facing an impossible situation. I told myself that my heart was buried with Emma and that all I could offer you was partnership and companionship." He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Sarah had learned indicated he was struggling with difficult emotions. "But somewhere along the way," he said quietly, "somewhere between that first dinner you cooked and watching you with your sisters today, I realized that my heart isn't as buried as I thought it was. I've fallen in love with you, Sarah, and I don't know what to do with that feeling." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat, her hand instinctively moving to touch the locket that rested against her chest. The admission hung between them in the lamplight, honest and vulnerable, and completely unexpected. "I don't expect you to return the feeling," James hurried to add. "I know this wasn't what you signed up for, and I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated in any way. But I needed you to know, needed to be honest about what's happening in my heart." Sarah stared at him, taking in the careful way he held himself, the obvious fear that he had overstepped some invisible boundary they had established. But as she looked at him, she realized that what she was feeling wasn't surprise or alarm, it was recognition. James, she said softly, reaching out to take his hand in hers. I think I've been falling in love with you too, and I've been too afraid to admit it, even to myself. The relief that flooded his expression was beautiful to see, transforming his features from careful constraint to something approaching joy. Really? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Really, Sarah confirmed, smiling through the tears that seemed to be becoming a regular feature of their important conversations. I never expected it, never thought it was possible, but yes, I love you, James Cartwright, and not just because you saved me from an impossible situation. I love the man you are, the way you've welcomed my sisters, the way you've made me feel like I belong somewhere again. James lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. So what happens now, he asked. Where do we go from here? Sarah considered the question, thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. They had begun as strangers brought together by necessity, had become friends through shared loneliness, and had somehow found their way to love through the simple act of building a life together. I suppose, she said slowly, we stop pretending that this is just a business arrangement and start acknowledging that it's become a real marriage. In every sense. James smiled, the expression lighting up his entire face. I'd like that very much, he said. I'd like that more than I can say. As the months passed, their marriage deepened and strengthened in ways that surprised both of them. What had begun as a practical arrangement born of mutual need had transformed into a partnership built on genuine love and respect. They worked together to improve the ranch, with Sarah proving to have an excellent head for business and James discovering that he enjoyed having someone to share his decisions and dreams with. Sarah's sisters visited regularly, and James began to think of them as his own family, involving himself in their lives and welfare with genuine care and concern. When Margaret expressed interest in becoming a teacher, he helped arrange for her to attend the territorial normal school. When Elizabeth's farming family fell on hard times, he quietly arranged for them to sell some of their excess grain through his contacts at a better price than they could have managed alone. The house that had once been a monument to grief became a home filled with life and laughter, with the sounds of conversation and music and the everyday activities of people who were building something meaningful together. Emma's memory was still honored and preserved, but it no longer dominated every room and every moment. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Sarah reflected on the strange turns that life could take, the way that endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to accept them. Do you ever regret it, she asked James suddenly, the way we came together, the circumstances that brought us to each other? James considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked him something important. I regret that you and your sisters had to go through such hardship, he said finally. I regret that my Emma had to die for me to understand how precious life really is. But do I regret that those circumstances brought us together? No, Sarah. Never. He reached over to take her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Sometimes I think that maybe Emma sent you to me, he said quietly. Maybe she knew that I was dying a little more each day in that big quiet house, and she found a way to send me someone who could teach me how to live again. Sarah squeezed his hand, feeling the truth of his words settle into her heart like seeds taking root in fertile soil. And maybe my parents found a way to make sure their daughters would all be taken care of, even after they were gone, she said. Maybe they knew that love has many different forms, and sometimes the most unexpected ones are the strongest. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah thought about the auction block where her story with James had begun, about the desperate transaction that had somehow transformed into the greatest blessing of her life. She thought about her sisters, safe and thriving in their new lives, and about the way a single act of unexpected kindness could change the trajectory of multiple lives. She thought about second chances and the courage it took to accept them, about the way grief and joy could exist side by side in the same heart, about the mysterious ways that love could grow in the most unlikely soil. And as James began to hum a melody that drifted across the evening air like a prayer, Sarah closed her eyes and felt truly, completely home for the first time since her parents had died. The auction had ended, But her real life was just beginning.